Welcome to the Meditation Nest. Here, bedtime stories become gentle meditations designed to help your thoughts unwind as you slow the tempo of your life and embrace the night ahead. I invite you to slow your breath, soften your thoughts, and find peace as you listen. This is your time to rest, reflect, and dream. Tonight's story is called Message in the Moss. In a quiet forest, far from the noise of the world, a botanist studying moss begins to notice something unusual. In small patches of green, faint words appear overnight. Simple messages that seem to arrive from the forest itself. At first, he tries to understand them, but over time, he begins to listen instead. This is a story about patience, stillness, and the quiet wisdom that grows slowly in the natural world. So settle in, get comfortable, and allow the rhythm of the forest to guide you gently toward rest. Deep in the woods, where the paths grow softer and the air carries the scent of rain even on dry days, there lived a botanist who had come to study moss. His name was Eli, and he had spent most of his life observing the quiet patience of plants. Trees were easy to admire and declared their presence to the sky. Wildflowers caught the eye with brief flashes of color. Ferns unfurled themselves in graceful spirals that seemed almost theatrical in their elegance. But moss asked for something different. Moss did not hurry. It didn't bloom brightly or stretch dramatically toward the sun. It spread slowly, softly, often unnoticed, beneath the larger life of the forest. Yet to Eli, moss had always seemed like the quiet language of the earth itself. It covered fallen logs like green velvet. It gathered in shaded corners of stone. It crept gently along the roots of ancient trees, weaving itself into the patient architecture of the forest floor. And so, for several weeks each year, Eli left the noise of cities behind and traveled to a small research cabin deep in the woodland to observe these small and steady ecosystems. The cabin itself was simple, a wooden structure tucked among tall pines, with a narrow porch and a single lantern that glowed softly in the evenings. A small kitchen held a kettle, a stack of enamel mugs, and a well-worn table where Eli kept his notebooks. There was no phone signal, no traffic, no interruptions except the occasional call of an owl drifting through the trees. For Eli, this quiet place was not loneliness. It was relief. Each morning, he woke before the sun had fully risen. The forest greeted the early hours with a hush that felt almost sacred. Mist often drifted between the trees, thin and silver in this dim light. Eli would step outside with a warm mug of tea and breathe in the cool air. And every morning, he reminded himself of the same quiet truth. The forest grows slowly, and so can you. After breakfast, he would pack a small canvas satchel with his tools, a hand lens, a soft brush, a notebook bound in green cloth. Then he would follow one of the narrow paths winding through the woods, moving carefully so the delicate moss beds beneath his boots would remain undisturbed. Studying moss required patience. Some species grew only a few millimeters each year. Others appeared overnight after a rainfall, spreading across stone like a thin green whisper before retreating again into dormancy. Eli loved this kind of work. It asked him to slow down, to kneel close to the ground, to notice things most people would walk past without a second thought. Tiny leaves shaped like stars, threads of moisture clinging to each blade. The quiet geometry of growth repeating itself again and again. Often, he would sit for long stretches beside a single patch of moss, sketching its patterns in careful detail. The forest did not mind his presence. Birds moved through the branches above him. A chipmunk occasionally paused nearby, curious but unconcerned. The wind passed through the pines in long, gentle breaths. And Eli worked quietly among them, content to observe. Days passed this way. Then one morning, something unusual caught his attention. It was a fallen log, thick with moss, lying beside a bend in the path. Eli had passed this log many times before, but today, as he knelt beside it, he noticed something strange about the moss growing across its surface. At first, he thought the pattern was simply a trick of the light. The morning sun filtered through the branches above, casting thin lines of brightness across the green surface. But as he leaned closer, the pattern remained. The moss seemed to have arranged itself into shapes. Not random shapes, curving lines, short strokes, almost like handwriting. Eli tilted his head. He ran his fingers lightly through the air above the log, but didn't touch the moss itself. The shapes were subtle. If he had been walking quickly, he might have missed them entirely. But kneeling there in the quiet forest, the pattern slowly became clearer. The moss had grown in a way that resembled a single word: wait. Eli blinked and leaned back slightly. Surely it was a coincidence. Nature produced strange patterns all the time. Rings in tree trunks, cracks in stone, clouds that resembled familiar shapes. The mind liked to find meaning even where none existed. He smiled softly to himself and made a small sketch of the pattern in his notebook. Then he closed the book and continued down the path. The forest, after all, was full of curiosities. But the next morning, something even stranger happened. Eli returned to the same path shortly after sunrise. Mist lingered low across the forest floor, and droplets of moisture clung to the moss like tiny beads of glass. As he approached the fallen log, he slowed his steps. The moss pattern from the day before had changed. The shapes had softened slightly, the letters dissolving into the natural spread of green. But a few feet farther along the log, a new pattern had appeared. Eli knelt again. This time, the moss formed another word: breathe. He frowned slightly. The letters were clearer than before, too clear, perhaps. He looked around the forest. The path behind him remained empty. No footprints disturbed the soft ground. No trimmed edges suggested someone had shaped the moss deliberately. The growth looked entirely natural, yet the word was unmistakable: breathe. Eli sat quietly beside the log for a long moment. A breeze moved gently through the trees overhead, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. The forest seemed calm, unconcerned, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Eli opened his notebook and carefully sketched the new pattern. Then he paused, listening. Sometimes the forest had its own way of reminding those who studied it of an important truth. The forest grows slowly, and so can you. Eli closed the notebook and sat beside the moss a little longer, breathing in the cool morning air. For the first time since arriving at the cabin that season, he decided not to hurry his work. Instead, he simply remained there, listening, watching the quiet life of the forest continue around him, breathing. That afternoon, Eli returned to the cabin with damp knees, a full notebook, and a mind that felt unusually restless. The cabin was quiet as ever. Sunlight moved through the trees, and laid pale shapes across the wooden floor. The kettle, blackened at the base from years of use, sat waiting on the stove. His coat hung near the door, still carrying the cool scent of the forest. Normally, Eli loved the simplicity of these afternoons. He would make tea, review his field notes, and let the day settle naturally around him. The forest had a way of loosening thought rather than lightening it. Even the questions he couldn't answer tended to soften there, as though the trees themselves preferred gentleness to certainty. But that day, his attention kept returning to the moss. Wait, breathe. 2 words appearing where there should have been none. He set water to warm and opened his notebook on the table. The sketches were careful, exact, each line drawn with the same restraint he brought to the rest of his work. He had noted moisture levels, tree cover, the angle of morning light. He had marked the type of moss and the condition of the fallen log. It all looked so proper on the page, so scientific, and yet none of it explained the quiet unease that had followed him back to the cabin. He had spent enough years in forests to know that not everything strange was mystical. Sometimes a curious pattern was simply that, a pattern. Sometimes the human mind, eager for narrative, arranged accidents into meaning. He knew all of this. Still, as the kettle began its soft whisper on the stove, he found himself tracing the penciled outline of the second word with one finger. Breathe. It wasn't, he thought, an unreasonable instruction. Outside, a breeze shifted through the pines. Somewhere near the cabin, a bird gave a brief, liquid call and fell silent again. Eli rose, poured water into his mug, and stood at the small kitchen window where the tea steeped. From there, he could see only the nearest trees and the first turn of the path, where ferns crowded the edges and moss climbed the stones in green layers thick as velvet. The woods looked exactly as they had the day before and the day before that. Calm, patient, untroubled by questions. He lifted the mug and let the warmth rest in his hands. The forest grows slowly, and so can you. He didn't know whether he was reminding himself or whether the forest was doing the reminding now. That evening came quietly. He lit the lantern on the porch just as dusk deepened between the trunks of the trees. Then he sat at the small table inside the cabin and wrote until the light thinned and the forest outside became one dark, breathing shape. He didn't write only about moss. He wrote about the sound of the wind changing after sunset, the way moisture returned first to the stones, the way twilight softened the edges of everything it touched. Much later, when sleep finally came, it came lightly, like mist settling over the ground. And in the morning, he woke with the strange, clear feeling that something was waiting for him. Not urgently, not impatiently, simply waiting. He dressed, brewed tea, packed his satchel, and stepped into the forest before the sun had fully climbed above the trees. The air held the coolness of night. The earth beneath the path was dark with moisture, and the moss shone fresh and deep green in the morning light. As he walked, Eli felt an unfamiliar hesitation. It wasn't fear. The forest had never frightened him. It was something quieter than that. A kind of inward stillness, as though some part of him had already begun listening before the rest of him caught up. When he reached the fallen log, he stopped. The first two words had nearly vanished. The place where weight had appeared was now only a softened patch of green, the letters gently blurred back into ordinary growth. Breathe lingered faintly nearby, but even that seemed to be dissolving into the patient spread of moss across bark. For a moment he thought perhaps that was all, that the strange sequence had ended as quietly as it had begun. Then he noticed another patch of moss a little farther down the log, closer to where the bark had split and curled away from the wood beneath. He knelt slowly. There, in darker green script, no wider than his hand, lay a third word: stay. Eli didn't open his notebook. He didn't immediately study the edges or compare the new growth to the sketches he had made before. Instead, he simply looked. Stay. The word rested there without insistence. Not a command exactly. Not a plea. More the kind of invitation only the quietest things know how to offer. Stay. Around him, the forest continued in its ordinary way. A droplet of water fell from one cedar branch to another. A blackbird shifted somewhere above him, dislodging a scatter of soft needles that drifted soundlessly toward the ground. The air smelled of wet bark, fern, and the mineral coolness that lingers near shade long after sunrise. Eli sat back on his heels and exhaled. He had come prepared, as always, to observe, to record, to interpret. But there was something in the stillness of that moment that made those habits feel unnecessary, or perhaps not unnecessary, only smaller than they had seemed before. He had spent a lifetime studying how things grew. He knew how moss responded to light, to moisture, to pressure and time. He knew the names of species most people had never noticed. He knew how to classify, compare, and preserve. Yet none of that knowledge felt especially useful beside the simple green word on the log. Stay. As though sensing that he had at last fallen quiet enough, the forest seemed to gather itself more fully around him. He heard the layered sounds he often missed while taking notes. The tiny ticking movement of an insect through dry leaves. The hush of wind higher in the canopy. The almost sound of moss holding water. He had once heard an older botanist say that forests do not reveal themselves to those who arrive with answers. At the time, Eli had taken this as romantic exaggeration, the sort of line people liked to repeat in lecture halls and field journals. Now, kneeling beside the fallen log, he wondered whether it had been the most practical wisdom he had ever received. He remained there for a long while, long enough for the coolness of the ground to begin seeping through the knees of his trousers, long enough for the urgency of interpreting the message to ebb away, long enough for the word before him to become less like writing and more like part of the forest itself. No stranger than the shape of lichen or the pattern of rings in old wood. When at last he rose, he did so without making a sketch. That surprised him. Normally he documented everything unusual, but some instinct, gentle and steady, told him not to pin this moment to a page. Not yet. Perhaps not at all. He continued walking through the woods that morning, but he no longer moved with the brisk, attentive rhythm of field work. His steps grew slower. He paused more often. Once, he stepped beside a moss-covered stone and did nothing for several minutes, except watch a line of ants navigate its curved green edge. The forest grows slowly, and so can you. This time, the phrase didn't feel like something he had chosen. It arrived the way birdsong arrived, or the scent of rain, simple, present, already true. Days began to change after that. Not dramatically, that was not the forest's way. But the shape of Eli's attention softened. He still carried his satchel. He still knelt beside logs and stones and made observations when they mattered. He still noted species, mapped moisture, and recorded the slow spread of living green across bark and soil. Yet more and more often, he let the notebook remain closed. He would sit on an old stump or beside the curve of a tree root and watch the forest without asking anything of it. He noticed how moss seemed to brighten after rain, as though lit from within. He noticed that certain patches held the morning mist longer than others. He noticed the rich silence beneath thicker stands of pine, where sound itself felt cushioned, softened by needles and moss and time. And sometimes, if he happened to pass the fallen log, he looked for the words. They were not always there. Some mornings he found nothing but uninterrupted green, and strangely, this no longer disappointed him. Other mornings, a faint curve or stroke would seem to rise from the moss, as though the forest were beginning to write again, only to blur back into ordinary growth by the time the sun had reached the top of the trees. He never saw another word as distinct as the first three. Wait. Breathe. Stay. But those three had begun to follow him anyway. They brought him steadiness. They felt calm and reassuring. When he reached too quickly for a conclusion, he heard wait. When he noticed his thoughts running ahead of him, he remembered breathe. When evening came, and he felt the old impulse to hurry through the quiet rather than inhabit it, there was stay. The messages, he realized, were no longer on the log alone. They had moved into the way he lived. One afternoon, after several days of rain, Eli wandered deeper into the woods than usual. The path narrowed there, then dissolved altogether into damp earth and roots. Ferns brushed softly against his coat as he passed. The trunks of older trees rose straight and pale through layers of green, their bark darkened by moisture. He arrived at a low clearing where a great stone sat half buried in the earth, its upper surface thick with moss so lush it looked like a hill seen from far above. He had visited the stone before, but never after rain like this. Water glimmered in the moss, each tiny leaf holding its own bright bead. Small threads of green reached over the stone's rounded edges and down into the shadowed soil below, where mushrooms, the color of warm cream, had appeared overnight. Eli lowered himself onto a dry patch of root nearby and sat without moving. The clearing was quiet and full in a new and different way. full of slow processes, of roots drinking, of bark drying, of spores settling, of water finding its downward path through the hidden architecture of the earth. There was no message written there that he could see, and yet everything around him seemed to say the same thing. Not in words, in rhythm, in patience, in the unwavering refusal to hurry. The forest grows slowly, and so can you. He smiled, not because he had solved anything, but because he had stopped needing to. That, he thought, might be the deeper gift of the woods. Not answers, but the release from the habit of demanding them too soon. By the final week of his stay, the air had shifted toward early autumn. Nothing dramatic had changed. The forest still held more green than gold, but the evenings cooled more quickly, and the first few leaves had begun to turn, pale and tentative, as though trying on the season before committing to it. Eli worked less and wandered more. He cooked simple meals in the cabin kitchen. He left the lantern low in the evenings and listened to the sounds outside. The pulse of crickets, the occasional fall of a pine cone, the distant and solemn call of an owl. Sometimes he stood at the counter with his hands wrapped around a mug and thought about how much of life was spent trying to outrun slowness. People hurried grief, hurried healing, hurried love, hurried rest. They treated delay as failure and patience as an inconvenience. They wanted roots without wading through seasons underground. But the forest never confused speed with wisdom. Nothing here strained toward becoming before it was ready. The moss didn't apologize for taking its time. The trees didn't force their rings. Even decay, which at first seemed like an ending, moved at a patient pace, making room quietly and without spectacle for new things to grow. On his last morning, Eli awoke before dawn. The cabin was still dim, the windows washed in blue-gray light. He made tea, though he didn't drink it right away. Instead, he stood for a moment, with both hands resting on the counter, listening to the familiar hush of the place. He felt something like gratitude, though the word seemed too small, not only for the forest, but for the way it had altered his days without ever demanding that he notice. He packed his satchel one final time, though lightly now, and stepped onto the path while the mist was still gathered low among the roots. He knew where he was going. The fallen log waited in its bend beside the path, exactly where it always had. When Eli approached it, he did so without anticipation, only with affection, perhaps, and a quiet curiosity softened now by trust. He knelt beside the moss. The place where the words had first appeared was no different from the rest. No lettering remained, no darker script, no trace of instruction, only moss, thick and green and velvety in the early light, spread patiently across the old bark, as though it had never written anything at all. Eli looked at it for a long time. Then he laughed, the sound little more than breath in the cool morning air. Of course, this would be the ending. Not a final sentence. Not some hidden revelation preserved for the last day. Only the return to simple green. And somehow, it was the most complete message of all, because what the forest had offered was never truly in the words. The words had only been a doorway. What mattered was what laid beyond them. The waiting, the breathing, the staying, the slow understanding that life did not need to be chased in order to be lived well. He reached out then, not to disturb the moss, but to hover his hand just above it, feeling the coolness gathered there. A thank you, perhaps, or simply a farewell. Then he rose. The path back to the cabin seemed softer that morning. Light moved carefully through the trees, and the mist was beginning to lift in pale ribbons. Somewhere nearby, water dripped steadily from a branch to the forest floor. Eli walked slowly, not because there was nowhere to be, though that was also true, but because he no longer wished to move any faster than the morning required. At the cabin, he packed his remaining things, washed his mug, and closed the windows one by one. Before leaving, he stood for a final moment in the small kitchen, where the counter still smelled faintly of tea and rain-damp wood. The cabin would wait for him. The forest would continue its patient work. Moss would go on growing over stone and bark and fallen wood, writing nothing, or perhaps writing always, in a language too quiet for haste to hear. Eli stepped outside and closed the door behind him. The trees received the sound and softened it. Then he turned toward the path that would carry him out of the woods and back into the wider world. He would return, he knew, but even before he did, some part of the forest would travel with him. In the pause before speaking, in the breath taken before worry could gather speed, in the choice to remain a little longer inside quiet moments rather than passing through them untouched. The forest grows slowly, and so can you. And with that thought resting gently in him, Eli walked on beneath the trees, while behind him the moss continued its patient work of covering, softening, and becoming once more simply and beautifully green. The end. Thank you for spending this quiet time in the meditation nest. If tonight's story helped your mind slow down, consider returning to it whenever the world begins to feel a little too hurried. Sometimes, the most important messages are the ones that arrive quietly. Until next time, may your thoughts grow softer, your breath grow slower, and your rest come easily. Good night. As this episode comes to a gentle close and the world outside grows quiet, may you find comfort within your own meditation nest. Let your mind settle softly. May tranquility wrap around you, inviting deep rest and serene dreams until dawn. If you'd like to help keep the meditation nest aglow, please consider buying me a cup of coffee by visiting ko-fi.com/BethPodcast. Every small kindness helps the light travel a little further. You can also access a free weekly blog on substack.com. Check the show notes for links. Until we meet again, rest in the quiet knowing that you are safely held by the night.